Welcome to Cleovis's early Texas literature timeline. We're going to explore the history of Texas literature from the period of Spanish exploration and conquest to Mexican Tejas, and lastly, the Republic of Texas. First, let's start with the earliest, one of the most famous Spanish works of Texas, which was Cabeza de Vaca's La Relacion, which serves as the first published literary work of the area, which is now known as Texas. The work is primarily descriptive in nature and purpose, which aligns with the literary style of later works, and describes the indigenous peoples, wildlife, and natural features of Texas and the Southwest. This style of descriptive travel narratives and memoirs continued to be the primary literary output of Texas until La Salle shipwrecked into Matagorda Bay. The advent of French Texas literature saw the introduction of poetry to the Texas literary canon. One of the earliest known works of possible, and I really mean possible, Texas poetry is dubbed the Mutineers poem, which came as a result of the failed La Salle expedition, which was found on a piece of parchment by indigenous Texans and was later transmitted to Spanish explorers. The work was identified initially as a work of poetry, however, later scholars dismissed it as a mere quote-unquote prosaic cry. The work was written by two of La Salle's company who were involved in his assassination and the mutiny against him, respectively Jean d'Arcueil and Jacques Grolet. Even though that there are some doubt that if the Mutineers poem is indeed a work of poetry, the La Salle expedition did produce one of the first works of Texas poems. According to Ratchford and Hatchron, there were the three first Texas poems. The first work that could be in their approximation called the first poem is an untitled Spanish work. The work was the product of the expedition of Captain Alonso de Leon and Father Damian Manazet in order to seek and destroy La Salle's fort that word traveled back to them he had established in Matagorda Bay. However, the expedition discovered the fort destroyed as a result of an attack from local indigenous peoples. The poem was then included in a report of the expedition and describes the carnage that was discovered at the fort. Now let's skip forward to a period following the Mexican War for Independence and before Texas initiated its revolution in 1835. The work entitled Texas by Mary Austin Holly was published in 1833 and was written by the cousin of impresario Stephen F. Austin, best known as the father of Texas. The book originally contained content based on a series of 12 letters sent from Texas. This novel offered a perspective of Texas to a broader American audience, attracting attention. But the events of the Texas Revolution and Republic began to draw even more attention from an American audience. Following the Battle of the Alamo, which saw the deaths of well-known figures of the American West, such as Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie, many were curious about the travels of these figures, especially in Texas, which then culminated in the publication of one of Texas's literature's most controversial works and biggest frauds. Colonel Crockett's Exploits and Adventures in Texas was a fabricated work attributed to a diary of Davy Crockett, the popular folk hero. However, in reality, it was written by the playwright Richard Penn Smith. However, more accurate accounts of Crockett's life in Texas ended up drawing more controversies than Smith's fabrication. Jose Enrique de la Peña's La Rebelión de Tejas serves as one of the most extensive accounts of the Texas Revolution from the Mexican perspective. The narrative originated as a 109-page manuscript written by de la Peña during the Revolution and then elaborated upon by field reports from himself and other officers into a 400-page work. The narrative details the Battle of the Alamo, depicting the death of William B. Travis, and the death of Crockett. However, Crockett is depicted as surrendering and later being executed as a prisoner of war. The work itself was published in 1955 in the original Spanish and then translated into English in 1975, and it generated great controversy with its depiction of Crockett's death and his supposed cowardice. However, many of the works of the Republic of Texas, like many of the ones we've mentioned, are only naturalistic or militaristic in account. However, one little-known work sheds significant light on the cultural practices of Tejanos and other groups, which are failed to be mentioned in other accounts of the Revolution. Mexico versus Texas was originally published in 1838 anonymously. However, the French Catholic missionary priest Anthony Gannel is held by scholars to be the author, as he later had the rights of the work granted to him in his name, as indicated through the second edition entitled Ambrosio de Letnes. The work itself bills itself to be an extensive description of the cultures and practices of Mexicans in Texas out the outbreak in the midst of the Texas Revolution. In whole, the literary works of early Texas provide not only a fascinating natural and cultural account of the region, but also allow for a deeper dive into a rich history of a land historically occupied and occupied till this day by diverse peoples and cultures. Thank you for joining Cleovis on our exploration of early Texas literature.